Welcome everyone, and thank you for coming. Today I'm going to be talking with you about Survivors United 2020, a virtual survivor-led response to early COVID-19 restrictions. Before we begin, I'd like to set the tone.
I watch my people on the streets fight a battle they don't even understand, trying to right a wrong that's long become a way of life. And there's no way out when they doubt their way in. When you don't know where you're coming from, roots lost as a cost of history, how can you know where you're going? Where you're going.
Thank you. So I wanted to first acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from Treaty 1 land, which is the land of the Dene, Anishinaabe, and Dakota people, and homeland of the Métis. I thought it was important to lead with that piece because, as we know, Black and Indigenous people are overrepresented by those involved in sex trafficking. Now, as we move forward, we're going to be talking about the sex industry and the impacts thereof. And as we know, the sex industry has evolved tremendously. Women and children are now sold through social media and online technology, which made the industry increasingly isolated and dangerous. These survivors were already vulnerable to violence, poverty, isolation, and so much more, and COVID-19 increased those risks tremendously. The need for social distancing disrupted our access to any informal supports that were relied on prior to COVID-19, such as family and friends. It also resulted in the gradual and continued restrictions and limitations to accessing the services and programming that some of these survivors previously relied on: medical, financial, housing, nutritional, counseling supports, and so on, things that supported their recovery. In turn, this increased the already high risk of suicides related to mental health challenges, homelessness, addictions, domestic violence, and so much more. Welcome. On March 12th, COVID-19 reached our city. By March 13th, all social services for our most marginalized and vulnerable populations were drastically restricted by a province-wide lockdown. I reached out to a peer. At the time, I had been working as an outreach counselor with women who were exiting the sex trade, and just the rapid changes in our services had really affected a number of us who were frontline workers with histories as sex trafficking survivors. Many of us felt almost a survivor's guilt, having no longer been involved in risky situations and having safe homes to be able to isolate and restrict in. So I phoned a friend, another survivor in the community, lived experience leader. She was feeling the same way. And that conversation expanded among 4 other people. Within 2 weeks, we had 128 folks that were interested in having this conversation and receiving support. In Tracia's trust report, it says that support from those with lived experience has been noted as a pivotal need. It also comments that communities can provide natural supports and fulfill a fundamental psychosocial need. And we're going to come back to the term community later on. But for now, we'll say that we agreed with that, and we wanted to be a part of creating something like that for those survivors that did not have access to their supports. So we came together, developed a mission to share COVID-19 related changes to resources that were relevant to survivors, and also to provide a platform for peer support during the pandemic. Our vision was to create a network of survivors in which peers could support each other both personally and professionally through sharing lived experience and modeling the life skills that we'd learned. And our values were those of trust, respect, and community. Our motto, peers supporting peers, survivors united, together we rise. Our primary goals were support and networking. We wanted to support survivors personally and professionally, and we wanted to be a bridge with existing organizations that worked with survivors, and we wanted to support the relationships with those organizations. In terms of networking, we wanted to start the conversation for an international or national survivor network, but also support knowledge sharing amongst survivors who, were aware of it, what resources were available and how things were changing. We do not believe that there is a one-size-fits-all formula for supporting survivors, and we understand that what works for one person may not work for another. And so having said that, we chose to remain open to the diverse and unique perspectives of all of the members of the survivor community. And that led us to take the position that Survivors United would be a non-judgmental space that did not discriminate against any particular therapeutic practice, political view, or religion. In respects to supporting adults who identify as exploited or as sex workers by choice, Survivors United supported the statement that sex work advocacy mixed up with combating sexual exploitation had polarized the conversation in our culture, and polarized these two issues, placing them in opposition with each other, creating competition and often lateral violence, when instead they should be viewed as a continuum of choice, and not that the experience of only one or the other was legitimate or more deserving of supports. It was identified that adults who identified as exploited or as sex workers by choice could be better supported, and that survivor-led initiatives and experiential experts with diverse perspectives should be supported. And we really wanted to be able to do that. We wanted to bring people together with diverse perspectives, and we were successful in doing so. But first we needed to kind of reframe the language. So we identified a survivor as an individual, any individual who had survived sex work, sex trafficking, or sexual exploitation, and identified themselves as survivors with a goal of recovery. And then we also had some descriptions for sex work, sexual exploitation, and sex trafficking. In both provincial and national reports on best practices for supporting sexually exploited and sex trafficked persons, recommendations to develop an adult strategy included the assertion that hearing from experiential voices is crucial. And that's something that we absolutely stand by and agreed with. So we developed a peer advisory council, and on that peer advisory council, we had pretty good representation. We had women who were involved in their own nonprofits. We had women who were pro-sex. We had women who were early in recovery, and we had those who were frontline leaders. So we did have a good array of folks to help us kind of define what we were doing as we went along. So what did we do and how did it work? Well, Survivors United was a peer-run, ally-supported, peer-led initiative. Initially, we had this, we're going to call it a peer-run, peer-supported, peer-led initiative, but we really wanted to be inclusive of our allies and have them be a part of this from the beginning. And so we felt that peer-run, ally-supported, peer-led initiative best embodied the goals that we were trying to meet, as well as being supportive of the research, which is again that ally organizations or organizations involved in the issue of sex trafficking and countering sex trafficking benefited from having lived experience leadership in the forefront and supporting that leadership. So we tried to create that culture. And we offered support through a private Facebook group that was by invite only, and a series of video conferencing events that offered theme-based support. So on the topic of being ally supported, in the report, Collaborations of Best Practices to End Sexual Exploitation and Trafficking in Manitoba, the first key finding identified was the need to use and expand existing resources via strategic partnerships related to online sexual exploitation and sex trafficking. This report also stated that collaboration over competition would lead to better outcomes, which is something that we also really believed in. So we hoped to develop synergetic relationships with survivor-serving organizations, and these organizations were invited to support Survivors United through a number of ways, in the hopes that we would be able to reduce barriers to services, complement that the peer support offered by Survivors United would be complemented by organizations. Closing gaps in the survivor community was important for us, and of course supporting lived experience leadership. So although not an exhaustive list, some of the ways that allies could have helped us and become involved was facilitating live online workshops for our members, providing pre-recorded orientations, kind of like virtual outreach or workshops. Referring participants to Survivors United was a big one, facilitating survivor-serving programming, sharing resource information as it changed and was needing to be updated for our members, mentoring or co-facilitating survivors in the community, including offering training for leadership roles within Survivors United, if and when there was funding that permitted that, and of course, donating various forms of operational support. We ran from March 31st to July 31st, 2020. And in that time, we provided 4 tutorials to members on how to operate the conferencing platform. We also offered 23 online, included in that, we offered 23 online sessions via video conferencing. It's going to go back for a second to the tutorials. Many of our members were unfamiliar with the platform. They weren't really sure how to navigate things. And so those 4 tutorials involved one of our core peer leader operating team sitting down with folks and just showing them how to navigate, how to mute their microphone, also going over some of the Zoom guidelines that we had for a safe space. Okay, so we had 5 planning and peer advisory meetings over the course of that time. We had 8 It's Okay Not to Be Okay groups, which was a wellness check-in group run by myself. We also had 2 drumming and peer support groups, which is the peer support group based on community themes identified by member feedback and ran by a phenomenal woman and the co-founder of Survivors United, who actually, as a peer leader, peer counselor, and one of the community organizations and programs that I started my healing journey in. So that it was really lovely to be able to do a full circle and do some work together. We had 2 elder teaching sessions, which was a peer support group based on traditional Indigenous teachings and ceremony. And this was led by an elder and grandmother in the community who's actually known by survivors nationally for some of her recent work, and very well loved. We had 2 soul care groups, which is a support group based on Christian teachings, also ran by a lived experience leader who has her own nonprofit, Setting the Captives Free, here in Winnipeg. She provides housing to folks that are in their second stage of recovery from exiting sex trafficking, as well as some group work and other counseling. So we had her do 2 soul care groups with our folks, and then we had our last peer leader, also lived experience leader, who is working in the community with women who have experienced sex trafficking from a justice lens. And she did 4 addiction support groups with us on addictions recovery that modeled AA to some degree with some modifications. So our most popular group of those was, of course, teachings from the elder and ceremony. And she spoke about healing as a woman, reclaiming your inner fire, and supporting one another as women in healing, in growing, in parenting, in life. And she, you know, folks really appreciated having that time with her. And some of the desired teachings that they talked about were wanting to know about, you know, warrior teachings, wanting to know about different animals, the alligator, the crocodile, the buffalo, the wolf, the bear, the butterfly, and what the teachings behind these animals were. They wanted to understand, you know, why 4 directions in the wheel and why the colors. And they were very invested in learning about medicines. How do you harvest them? Where do you harvest them? Which ones are detoxifying? So there's a lot of really good things there that we learned in terms of what folks wanted to know about Indigenous practices. As I said earlier, that our themes were selected based on emerging trends among attending member feedback. And so some of the things that kind of came up that folks wanted to talk about was parenting through a pandemic, the impacts of pandemic trauma on pre-existing PTSD and CPTSD, and the need for that to be normalized by peers. A lack of access to supports and routine was a big one, as was fear of relapse because of that lack of access for those who were in early recovery and successful, but obviously re-experiencing a lot of really big feelings without access to support. Absence of spiritual connection and or ceremonial exposure and collectivity was another big one. And then anxiety and resource sharing between peers. So Tracy's trust report stated that all programs and services should use lived experience leaders in all aspects of program development and service delivery. And we really worked towards doing that. We engaged experienced and skilled lived experience leaders as our core operational volunteers, as you heard. We also had a variety of topics facilitated by several members of the Tracy's Trust Advisory Council. We provided co-facilitation support, and that was across the board. So we always had two operational volunteers in every meeting, one to lead and one to manage keeping the space safe by being a video conferencing host. We also had member facilitators, and we were able to offer support to one member on 2 occasions as someone who was presenting material as a leader. And we supported this person by helping them develop the lesson, including preparation, co-facilitating with them, and then debriefing with them afterwards. And folks were of the understanding as well. We developed the material that they wanted to teach with them so that we would be also familiar with it in the event that they decided that they weren't ready or they didn't want to go through the entire thing. It was easy for the peer leader who was supporting them at that point to just carry on in their stead if they gave us the cue that that was what they were needing. And all facilitators got before and after care as well. Before and after care, sorry, that looked a lot like checking in and just, you know, examining how they did, how they felt about how the group went, if they felt that they kept the space was kept safe, and if there were any challenges that had been run into, some brainstorming around how that could look differently next time. Okay, so member volunteer roles. Trauma-informed care means working with survivors to identify and focus on their strengths or the qualities that they already possess. And that focusing on strengths can be helpful in increasing survivors' self-esteem. And this isn't something that we just know or believe. This is something that we live by as lived experience leaders, because we do know that when we focus on our strengths, it does increase our self-esteem and is incredibly powerful elixir for recovery. We believe that offering honorariums for leadership engagement would foster programming ownership for our members and promote group cohesion, allowing for members to meet their resource needs without having to overcommit, and provide diversity as well in content and delivery, and create scheduling flexibility. So people could volunteer for an hour, they can volunteer for 10, then they were, our goal was to pay them an hourly rate. Our members were invited to become engaged as video conferencing hosts. social media managers, member co-facilitators, workshop leaders, peer assistants, delivery persons, volunteer coordinators, and so much more, according to their gifts and strengths. So what were our outcomes? 61% of our membership identified as exited, and more than half had been engaged as lived experience leaders through employment, school, volunteering, committee and coalition work, or as public speakers. So what that means, engaged as lived experience leaders, is that they were invited to participate as a direct result of being someone who identified as a survivor of sex trafficking. Okay, and 75% of our membership were seeking support. 43% were seeking opportunities to exercise and develop peer leadership. When identifying program needs, members expressed an interest in or knowledge of cultural teachings. 71% cultural teachings and 25% Christian teachings. 39% of our members attended 3 or more groups, and an average of 4 participants attended each group. We also were able to hand out 15 medicine kits to folks, and that was really great to be able to do that. When speaking to our members about what Survivors United meant to them, some of the things that they said about its impact was that they were grateful to be able to connect with peers. Some would come into group feeling triggered, feeling broken, and they would leave feeling strengthened, energized, and clearer about what to do for themselves. So that was really positive, and that's what we were looking for, right? Is for people to leave feeling encouraged and ready to continue on in their recovery. So we asked survivors, what is your dream or vision for the Survivors United community? And their response actually really mirrored a statement made in the Mukimikanak Traditional Road to Healing study by Tammy Nelson that stated that folks were expressing needing and wanting a space that offered wraparound services where they could access knowledge keepers, social workers, experiential women to mentor them, and programming that is geared to rebuild their identity as Indigenous women. Now, of course, for our community, as in addition to rebuilding identity as Indigenous women, for some, because not all were Indigenous, there was a common goal of wanting to rebuild their identity as thrivers, moving from survivors to thrivers. And so, yeah, what they asked for was a one-stop shop website. They asked that survivor leaders continue to be supported, and they really wanted to see this be something that stretched across Canada and the USA. When asked, what does the Survivors United community mean to you? We heard things like, no survivor gets left behind or unsupported. It was a sisterhood of the most courageous and resilient woman I have ever met. It is a safe space to speak out, be ourselves, and not be alone. And this, from a pro-sex worker, we all get it. So our trauma, despite our differences. So we understood the experience of trauma and violence that happened within the sex industry, whether we identified as pro-sex or sexually exploited or sex trafficked. And I felt that that was really important to note. On the topic of communities, we say communities can provide natural supports and fulfill a fundamental psychosocial need. Survivors United was a community. Community is defined as a group of people who share a particular characteristic, as well as a feeling of fellowship with others as a result of sharing common experiences, interests, attitudes, and or goals. And we were a group of people who shared the characteristic of surviving the sex industry. And we had the common goal of recovering from trauma. And that is what Survivors United community was built on. Speaking of community, many members of our community graced us with their time, feedback, and support while juggling the increased demands of the pandemic in their own work and professional lives. For some, it was an isolated conversation about a pertinent detail. For others, it was ongoing responsiveness to and or advocacy on behalf of Survivors United. So we wanted to take this moment to say, although we couldn't acknowledge everyone today, we do appreciate all your efforts to support lived experience leadership and peer support, and we applaud your commitment to supporting the survivor community. For those who gave me permission to use their names, I will say thank you to co-founders Kim Trossel and Ashley Trent, and thank you to Jackie Hayes, Jane Runner, Carrie Winslow, Celia Williamson, Charlotte Mickelson, the Kenora Sexual Assault Center, the Human Trafficking and Social Justice Institute, Tracy's Trust Advisory Council of Knowledge Keepers. We thank you so much for your participation and support.